"You're not qualified to touch him," Dr. Marcus Whitfield snapped, his voice cutting through the trauma bay like a blade through gauze. "Step away from my patient before I have security remove you." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Bay 4 of St. Adeline Medical Center, throwing a flat, merciless white over the scene. A man lay on the gurney, his chest rising in shallow, uneven pulls, blood soaking through a field dressing someone had applied in a hurry and applied wrong. The monitor beside him chirped an irregular rhythm, the kind of sound that made junior residents' hands start to shake. Nurse Dana Acaffer stood in the doorway of the supply corridor, a stack of folded blankets forgotten in her arms, because she had just watched something Dr. Whitfield hadn't. She had watched the woman in the bloodied scrub top, the one everyone called quiet, the one who kept to herself on the overnight shifts, reach for the dressing with hands that did not shake at all. Dana's eyes dropped for just a second to the edge of a faded tattoo peeking out from beneath the woman's rolled sleeve. A small black diamond inked over a scar that ran the length of her forearm. Dana had never asked about it. Nobody had. The woman standing over the patient was Captain, though nobody at St. Adeline knew to call her that, Renata Cole, 34 years old, a trauma nurse who had worked the graveyard shift at St. Adeline Medical Center in Portland, Oregon for the past 3 years. She did not look up when Dr. Whitfield spoke. She did not flinch. She simply pressed 2 fingers to the patient's carotid, counted, and said nothing at all. A nurse who folded towels like she was diffusing something. A woman the hospital was about to lose without ever knowing what it had. If you've never heard a story like this before, settle in, because this one earns every minute of your time. And if this is your first time here, consider staying a while longer. Hit subscribe, because there's more where this came from. This channel tells the true stories of women the world walked past, women who carried entire histories inside them that nobody thought to ask about. Now, let's get into it. 3 hours before Dr. Marcus Whitfield ever raised his voice in Bay 4, the emergency department at St. Adeline Medical Center had not slowed down for sunrise. It rarely did. The waiting room had been full since 1 in the morning. A fractured wrist from a skateboarding accident. A toddler with a fever spiking past 104. An elderly man complaining of chest pain who turned out, after 20 minutes of quiet, careful questioning, to be having a heart attack nobody else had caught yet. Renata had been on shift for 31 hours. Not by choice, a call-out from the day nurse, a short-staffed unit, and Renata's own quiet inability to leave a department she knew was drowning. Her scrubs, pale blue at the start of the shift, had gone the color of rust in 3 places. There was a dry, dark stain on her left knee where she had knelt on the tile beside a gunshot victim 2 nights prior, a stain the industrial laundry hadn't quite lifted out. Her right knee ached with a dull, familiar throb, an old injury she never explained, and nobody had the nerve to ask about twice. What people noticed about Renata Cole, if they noticed her at all, was how little she seemed to notice them. She moved through the department with an economy of motion that read, to the residents fresh out of their programs, as coldness. She did not rush. She did not raise her voice. When a code was called, she did not sprint toward it. She walked, fast and level, arriving exactly when she was needed and not a half-second sooner, as if she had already run the numbers on how much time she had. The younger nurses whispered about it in the break room sometimes, how Renata Cole never seemed rattled, never seemed tired, even when the rest of them were running on fumes and vending machine coffee. They called her intense, in the careful way people describe someone they don't quite understand. What they didn't know was that Renata had learned to move that way somewhere else, somewhere that had nothing to do with hospital corridors, and that the stillness they mistook for detachment was the most disciplined thing about her. There was a particular rhythm to how she worked a shift, one that a keener observer might have noticed followed the same logic as a checklist committed so deeply to memory it no longer felt like a checklist at all. She restocked the crash cart at the start of every shift without being asked, counting each item under her breath the way a person counts rounds in a magazine. She kept a small notepad in her scrub pocket, not for patient notes, but for tracking which residents had shown competence with which procedures, an old habit from a life where knowing who could be trusted with what wasn't a courtesy, it was survival. She ate standing up, fast, functional meals, the way soldiers eat when they've learned that food is fuel and nothing more, no matter how many times the day nurse manager teased her about it. The elderly man with chest pain, the one nobody else had caught in time, was named Harold Weiss, 61 years old, a retired postal worker who had come in complaining only of indigestion and a strange tightness in his jaw. Renata had watched him for less than 90 seconds in the waiting room before she pulled him back for an EKG, overriding the triage order by 2 full hours because something in the particular pallor of his skin, a gray that sat wrong against the fluorescent light, told her his heart didn't have 2 hours to wait. The EKG confirmed what she already suspected. He was moved to cardiology within the hour, his life almost certainly saved by a decision nobody but Renata had thought to make, and nobody but Renata had thought worth mentioning afterward. She had spent 4 years training her body not to waste a single motion, because motion, in the world she came from, cost lives. She had spent the years since trying to unlearn just enough of that discipline to seem ordinary, and failing mostly, because some things do not come back out of a person once they've gone in. The nurses who worked closest to her had started to notice a pattern. When things were calm, Renata was invisible restocking supply carts, charting quietly, letting the louder personalities take up the room. But when something went wrong, when a patient started crashing and the room filled with noise and panic, something in her sharpened. She became more present, not less. The younger staff didn't understand it yet. They would. What none of them knew, what nobody at St. Adeline Medical Center had ever been told, because Renata had never told them, was that 4 years earlier, in the mountains outside Kunduz, Afghanistan, Renata Ashworth Cole had been known by a different name entirely. To the 7 men she had kept alive over 11 hours of sustained enemy contact on a ridge with no extraction window and no working comms, she had been widow 6. The call sign had come from an incident that had nothing to do with mourning and everything to do with what she had done during it. Her unit, a Joint Special Operations Medical Detachment, had been ambushed during a routine resupply run that turned into something much worse. The convoy took fire from 3 directions. The lead vehicle was disabled in the first 90 seconds. Renata, then a combat medic sergeant attached to a Special Forces ODA, had pulled 2 men from a burning vehicle, stabilized a sucking chest wound using a strip of a dead man's uniform because her kit had been shredded by shrapnel, and held a collapsing airway open with her own gloved fingers for 40 minutes because the only tool that could have done the job had been lost in the blast. When the extraction helicopter finally arrived, every man she had touched was still breathing. The team leader, a grizzled master sergeant who did not hand out compliments easily, told the debrief officer that she had moved through that ridge like death itself, had come to collect and changed its mind at the last second. The name stuck, Widow 6. It followed her through 2 more deployments before she left the service entirely. She did not talk about it, not because the memory was too painful to touch, though some days it was, but because she did not want to be listened to differently once people knew. She had watched it happen to others, the way a room shifted around a person once their history came out, the way people stopped seeing you and started seeing the story. She wanted to be Renata the nurse, not Renata the war story. She wanted her competence to stand on its own, unremarkable and unexplained, the way anyone's competence should be allowed to. There was a version of the story she sometimes told herself late at night, off shift. Alone in the small rented house she kept on the outskirts of Portland. A version where she let herself remember the weight of the 7th man, the one she'd carried the last 400 meters to the extraction point, because he could no longer walk on the leg she'd already field splinted twice. She remembered the particular sound the rotor blades made cutting through mountain air at altitude, a sound that still, 4 years later, made her chest tighten when a hospital helicopter passed low over the parking lot. She remembered the smell of scorched earth and copper that had followed her home in ways no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed. She had left the army 18 months after Kunduz, not because she'd stopped believing in the work, but because she had wanted, for the first time in her adult life, to save people without also having to watch some of them die anyway, in a place where the odds were stacked from the start. Dr. Marcus Whitfield had run the trauma service at St. Adeline Medical Center for 19 years. He was not, by any honest account, a cruel man. He had built the department from a chronically understaffed, poorly funded unit into one of the most respected level II trauma centers in the Pacific Northwest, and he had done it through sheer force of will and an unbending belief in hierarchy. That chains of command existed because chaos was the alternative, and that his job was to be the wall between his patients and chaos. He genuinely believed that the rigid structure he enforced protected people, that clear lines of authority saved lives when things went sideways. Somewhere in 19 years, though, that belief had calcified into something else. The wall he had built to protect his patients had slowly become a wall that protected his own certainty instead, and he had stopped noticing the difference. He did not tolerate deviation from protocol, not because protocol was always right, but because deviation implied that someone, somewhere, knew something he didn't, and Marcus Whitfield had spent 2 decades being the person in the room who knew the most. It showed in small ways most days. He corrected residents in front of patients rather than pulling them aside. He referred to nurses by their last names only, clipped and impersonal, a habit he had never examined. He had a way of looking past people who weren't attending physicians, as though the space they occupied in the room was slightly less real than his own. Renata had felt that look pass over her more than once in 3 years and had never once let it land. The inciting moment came just after 5 in the morning. During the chaos surrounding the chest pain patient Renata had flagged an hour earlier. His name was Harold Weiss, 61 years old, and the monitors had not yet caught what was happening to him, but Renata had. She noticed the faint gray creeping into his lips, the way his breathing had gone shallow and fast in a pattern she recognized from 100 other bodies in 100 other rooms. Without asking anyone's permission, she repositioned his IV line, which a first-year resident had placed too shallow to run fluid effectively, and called for a 12-lead EKG before anyone else in the bay had registered a change. She did it quietly. She stepped back before the resident could thank her, back into the periphery of the room, back into the version of herself that did not need acknowledgement. But Dana Okafor saw it. Dana always seemed to be nearby when Renata worked, watching with the quiet fascination of someone taking notes for a test she didn't know she'd have to pass. 20 minutes later, in Bay 4, with the gunshot patient bleeding out beneath fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly dead already, Dr. Whitfield arrived to find Renata already working, cutting away the improperly applied field dressing, assessing the wound with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who had done this 100 times in places far worse than a hospital. "What do you think you're doing?" Whitfield said, stepping into the bay, his voice carrying the particular sharpness of a man who did not like walking into a room mid-decision that wasn't his. "He's got a tension pneumothorax developing on the left side," Renata said, not looking up. "Breath sounds are absent, trachea's shifting. He needs decompression now, not in the 4 minutes it'll take you to review the chart." "You don't diagnose in my trauma bay." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "You're a floor nurse, not a physician. You're not qualified to touch him. Step away from my patient before I have security remove you." "With respect, doctor, he doesn't have 4 minutes." "That wasn't a request, Nurse Cole." Renata's hands did not stop moving. She kept 2 fingers pressed lightly against the patient's ribs, counting intercostal spaces with the same unhurried certainty she'd once used to count seconds until a helicopter arrived. "I understand it wasn't," she said, in the flat, level tone of someone delivering a diagnosis to a family that doesn't want to hear it. I'm telling you what's happening in his chest regardless." Whitfield's face reddened. He was aware, in the peripheral way that men like him often are, that the room had gone quiet around them. Two residents and a nurse frozen mid-motion, watching. "This is insubordination," he said. "You'll be suspended pending review. Step back from the patient." "You have 30 seconds to justify overriding my order," Whitfield said, "or this becomes a formal write-up." "I don't need 30 seconds, and I'm not interested in justifying it. I'm interested in keeping him alive." Renata's tone stayed level, almost gentle, the way a person speaks when they've decided the argument itself is a luxury they can't afford. "You can write me up after his SAT comes back above 90. "I'd prefer to keep working on him," Renata said. Nothing in her voice rose, nothing in her posture changed. "Look at the monitor. SAT's dropping. Count how many seconds he's got left before this becomes a code, and then decide if you still want me to stop." She went very still as she said it, not frozen, not frightened, but still in a way that seemed to draw the air out of the room and hold it. It was the stillness of someone who had made peace, a long time ago, with the fact that some rooms would not understand her until it was almost too late, and that being understood was never the point. Something in her voice, low, unwavering, carrying none of the defensiveness the moment would have justified, bypassed every assumption Whitfield had built about her in 3 years and landed somewhere in the room that recognized, on instinct, the presence of real authority. 2 of the younger staff members felt it before they understood why. Dana Ackhaffer, still in the doorway, felt her own breath catch. The doors to Bay 4 opened before Whitfield could answer. 2 paramedics wheeled in a gurney, moving fast, calling out vitals to anyone who would listen. The man on it wore the tattered remains of a flight suit, an olive-drab jacket burned through at the shoulder, and a security detail badge clipped to his collar that read U.S. Army Special Operations Command. Behind the gurney walked a man in a dress uniform, silver stars on his shoulders, his face gray with something that wasn't only exhaustion. General Frank Delacroix had been at St. Adeline for less than 90 seconds when his eyes swept the trauma bay and stopped, absolutely stopped, on the woman standing beside Bay 4's gurney with 2 fingers pressed to a dying man's ribs. He did not move for 3 full seconds. He did not breathe for the first one of them. "Widow 6, he said. The words came out low, disbelieving, the way a man speaks when he is looking at a ghost he had personally helped bury. Renata's hands paused just barely over the patient's chest. General Delacroix straightened, and in the middle of a trauma bay full of monitors and blood and fluorescent hum, a 2-star general raised his right hand to his brow in a salute so precise it looked rehearsed, though it was not. It was instinct. It was 4 years of memory arriving all at once. "Sergeant Cole," he said, correcting himself, his voice thick. "My God, it's really you." The room reconfigured itself around those 2 words in a way that took less than 5 seconds and changed everything. Dr. Whitfield's mouth opened and then closed again. He looked at Renata, really looked, for what might have been the first time in 3 years, and something in his face shifted, the certainty draining out of it like water finding a lower point. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply understood all at once that he had been wrong, and that the wrongness went deeper than this single moment. Nobody humiliated him for it. Nobody needed to. Renata had already turned back to the patient on the gurney. Because the man in Bay 4 still needed her more than the room needed a reckoning. 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, Renata said to the nearest resident, her voice exactly as level as it had been 3 minutes earlier, as though nothing at all had changed. "Now, please." The resident, a young man named Devin Ashcroft who had spent the last 10 minutes silently praying someone else would take charge, moved without hesitation. Renata guided his hands through the decompression, narrating each motion with the calm cadence of someone who had taught this exact procedure to panicked medics on ridgelines with far less light and far worse odds. The needle found its mark. Air hissed free. The patient's oxygen saturation began, almost immediately, to climb. "Good," Renata said. "Chest tube kit 32 French. We'll need it in the next 2 minutes." Behind her, General Delacroix had crossed the room to stand beside the gurney his own medical team had wheeled in, the burned soldier, a 26-year-old ranger named Corporal Elias Vance, whose blood pressure had begun to fall in a way the field medics accompanying him hadn't been able to stabilize. Renata's eyes moved to the second patient without her feet needing to follow, assessing him from 6 feet away in the particular way trauma medics learn to triage a room instead of a single body. "He's got a compromised airway from the burn," she said. "Get me a bougie and a 6.5 ET tube, and somebody page anesthesia, but don't wait for them." She crossed to Corporal Vance's side, and in under 90 seconds, secured an airway that the field team had been struggling with for the better part of 20 minutes, her hands moving with a precision that made the intubation look almost gentle despite the violence of what it was doing. Dana Ockhaffer, no longer standing frozen in the doorway, had moved to assist, handing instruments before Renata asked for them, having apparently decided, somewhere in the last 5 minutes, that she would rather be useful than astonished. A third patient arrived from triage, the overflow from a 2-car accident on the interstate, a teenage girl with a suspected spinal injury whose mother was sobbing in the hallway loud enough to be heard through 2 sets of doors. One of the newer nurses, a young man named Curtis Pham, had frozen at her bedside, his hands shaking too badly to secure the cervical collar correctly. Renata crossed to him without breaking her rhythm on Vance's IV line, placed one hand briefly on Pham's shoulder and said, low enough that only he could hear it, "Breathe out. You know how to do this. I've watched you do it. Do it now and I'll be right here." Pham's hands steadied. The collar went on correctly on the second attempt. Renata did not stay to watch him finish. She trusted that he would, and moved on to check the pressure on Weiss's chest tube, adjusting the drainage seal with a glance that took in numbers on 3 different monitors at once. Then came the fourth decision, the one that would later find its way into the incident report as a single clinical sentence, but had taken every second of judgment Renata had. Corporal Vance's blood pressure, which had leveled after intubation, began to slide again, not dramatically, not the kind of drop that trips an alarm, but the kind a trained eye catches in the shape of a trend line rather than a single number. She recognized it as internal bleeding masked by the burns, a slow leak the field team's imaging hadn't caught because they'd been fighting the airway instead. She called for 2 units of O-negative before the monitor had confirmed what she already knew, and paged the on-call surgical resident directly rather than waiting for the standard consult chain, a decision that would have cost precious minutes had she followed protocol instead of instinct. The surgical resident, arriving at a dead run, would later tell colleagues that Vance would not have made it to the OR alive if she'd waited the standard 15 minutes for the page to route through channels. She managed all of this while, 6 feet away, Curtis Pham's composure cracked again, not from the collar this time, but from the accumulated weight of a first year that had never prepared him for a night like this one. His hands had gone still on the girl's gurney, his breathing shallow and fast, the early architecture of a panic spiral. Renata didn't stop what she was doing with Vance's line. She simply raised her voice half a register, enough to carry without alarming the room, and said his name once, evenly. "Curtis, eyes on me for 1 second." He looked up. "You're doing this right. I need you to keep doing it right for 4 more minutes, and then you can fall apart in the break room if you need to. Not before." It wasn't gentle exactly, but it wasn't cold either. It was the particular kindness of someone refusing to let a person quit on themselves mid-task, because she had needed that same refusal from someone else once, on a ridge, a long time ago. Dr. Whitfield stood near the supply cart for a long moment, doing nothing that anyone would notice, restocking gauze, checking a blood pressure cuff, small tasks that kept his hands occupied, while the room organized itself around someone who was, by any formal measure, still beneath him in the hospital's hierarchy. He did not give orders. He did not try to reclaim the room. He simply became, for the first time in 19 years inside that department, a pair of useful hands rather than the center of gravity. At one point, he found himself handing Renata a suture kit before she'd asked for it, anticipating her next move the way he might have anticipated his own a month earlier. And something in that small act of following rather than leading seemed to cost him nothing at all, which surprised him more than anything else that morning had. It took 40 minutes for the trauma bay to stabilize into something resembling calm. Harold Weiss's chest tube was draining cleanly, his color returning. Corporal Vance's vitals had leveled, his airway secure, awaiting transfer to the burn unit. The teenage girl had been moved to imaging, her mother finally breathing normally in the hallway. Renata Cole stood in the center of it all, her scrubs soaked through in fresh places now, her expression as unreadable as it had been 3 hours earlier, when nobody in the building had known her name. General Delacroix found her 20 minutes later in the instrument room, where she had gone to restock a cart. Nobody had asked her to restock, because her hands needed something to do and her mind needed a quiet place to catch up with what her body had already handled. He knocked once on the open-door frame, an oddly formal gesture from a man who outranked nearly everyone in the building. "Sergeant Cole," he said again, softer this time. "It's just Renata now, sir," she said, not turning around. "Has been for a while." "I looked for you," he said. "After Kunduz, after you separated. I wanted to write a recommendation for the Bronze Star packet the team put in, the real one, not the watered-down version that made it through review. You'd already left no forwarding address by the time it cleared." He reached into his jacket and withdrew something small, setting it on the counter beside her, a challenge coin, heavy brass, the SOCOM crest on one face and on the other, an engraving she recognized without needing to read closely. A small black diamond, the same one inked into the skin of her forearm. "This has been sitting in my desk drawer for 4 years," he said. "I didn't know who to give it to. I do now." Renata looked at the coin for a long moment before she picked it up, turning it once between her fingers, feeling its weight the way she might check a pulse. "I appreciate it," she said. "I'm not sure I'm the person it was meant for anymore." "You just ran a mass casualty scenario in a civilian trauma bay like it was Tuesday," Delacroix said. "That woman is still very much standing in this room." "She's part of me," Renata said. "Not all of me. I built something after Kunduz, a life that doesn't ask me to be Widow 6 every day. I don't want to trade it back for a uniform, not even a ceremonial one." She set the coin down gently, not as a refusal but as a boundary. "The person who did what I did on that ridge and the person standing here right now, they're connected, but they're not the same person anymore. That distinction matters to me more than the coin does." Delacroix studied her for a long moment, something like understanding, reluctant, respectful settling into his features. "I won't pretend I follow all of that," he said, "but I'm not going to argue with a woman who just decompressed a chest with a 14-gauge needle and didn't break a sweat." He looked, for a moment, older than his silver stars suggested. A man who had spent a career giving orders that sent people like her into rooms he never had to enter himself. "For what it's worth, Sergeant Renata, the men on that ridge still talk about you. Vance's team will too, once he's well enough to talk about anything. You gave them a life to go back and be ordinary in. I think that's worth more than most of the medals we hand out." He didn't push further. He simply nodded. Once, the way soldiers acknowledge a decision they respect even when they don't fully understand it, and left the coin on the counter where she could choose, later, whether to carry it. She stood alone in the instrument room for a long moment after he left, listening to the low mechanical hum of the sterilizer, the coin catching light from the overhead fixture. She did not pick it up right away. When she finally did, she slid it into the pocket of her scrubs rather than her bag, not because she had decided to carry it forward as an identity, but because some things she had learned were better kept close without being worn on the outside. 3 weeks later, Dr. Marcus Whitfield sat alone in his office after his shift had ended, the overhead light off, his desk lamp throwing a narrow circle of yellow across a folder he had pulled from records. The incident report from the morning General Delacroix had walked into his trauma bay. He had read it 4 times already. He read the final line again now. Nurse R. Cole's intervention prevented cardiac arrest in patient Weiss by an estimated 3-4 minutes. He looked for a while at his own hands resting on the desk, the hands that had pointed at Renata Cole and told her she wasn't qualified to touch a dying man. There was no press conference in his reckoning, no public apology staged for an audience. He found her the following week in the staff corridor near the break room and said, simply, "I was wrong. Not procedurally wrong about you. I've thought about it every day since, and I don't have a clean way to explain it except that I stopped seeing the people in that department a long time ago, and I saw a stripe on your name tag instead of what you actually were." He did not qualify it. He did not soften it with an explanation about protocol or hierarchy. Renata listened, nodded once, and told him she appreciated him saying it, without telling him it was fine because it hadn't been, and she had learned a long time ago not to perform forgiveness she didn't fully feel yet. The following Tuesday, Renata Cole clocked in for her shift at 6 in the evening, same as always. She picked up a clipboard from the nurse's station, checked the whiteboard for bed assignments, and walked into Bay 2, where an elderly woman was waiting for a wound dressing change. The department moved around her exactly the way it always had: phones ringing, monitors chirping from 3 directions, residents hurrying past with charts under their arms, none of them pausing to consider what had happened in Bay 4 3 weeks earlier, because the world rarely pauses for the things that mattered most in it. Renata had never needed it to. She had spent 4 years learning that recognition was not the same as purpose, and she had built a life around the second one instead of waiting for the first. She checked the dressing, adjusted the tape, and moved on to the next bed, because that was where she was needed, and that had always been enough. There's something in Renata Cole's story that stays with you long after it ends, and it isn't the salute, or the challenge coin, or even the moment Marcus Whitfield's certainty cracked open in a trauma bay at 5 in the morning. It's the 3 years before that moment, the years she spent restocking supply carts and charting quietly and letting people mistake her stillness for coldness, never once trying to correct them. We build our judgments of people so quickly, and so often out of the smallest available evidence. The uniform someone isn't wearing, the title that isn't printed on their badge, the way they carry themselves when nobody important is watching. We decide what a person is capable of based on what they happen to be holding when we meet them, and we rarely think to ask what they used to hold instead. Renata never asked to be believed. She only asked in the end to be allowed to work. The world gave her that much, eventually, though it took a general's memory and a dying man's collapsing lung to get there. Not every act of quiet competence gets its moment of recognition. Most don't. But the kind of integrity that does the work anyway, without waiting for permission or an audience, is the kind that was never really asking for either one. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding it together. And if you haven't already, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it means you won't miss what comes next. These stories exist because you keep showing up for them. Thank you.